They call us the first responders, but they don't tell you about the toll it takes. I spent 25 years in a windowless room, surrounded by the hum of servers and the flickering glow of 6 different monitors. Most nights it's just noise. But sometimes a call comes in that feels like a cold hand reaching through the headset and grabbing your heart. I've kept a personal archive of the calls that the department tried to bury, the ones that didn't fit into a police report. Tonight, I'm going to let you hear the stories that change the way I look at the world. Pour yourself some coffee, turn down the lights, and listen closely. Because in this job, you learn one thing very quickly. The silence is never truly empty. It was January 2004, a night that the city's weather archives simply remember as the Great Whiteout. A record-breaking blizzard had turned the entire metropolitan area into a silent, white tomb. Outside the dispatch center, the wind was screaming, shaking the industrial windows of the building. But inside, the atmosphere was thick with the hum of servers and the smell of stale, burnt coffee. I was the only dispatcher on duty for the graveyard shift, sitting in a pool of dim blue light from my monitors. The lines had been unnervingly quiet for hours. Just the occasional report of a fallen power line or a car sliding into a ditch. Then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., Line 4 lit up. I remember the way the red light reflected off my coffee cup. I picked up, and for a few seconds there was nothing but the sound of someone breathing. A shallow, jagged sound that told me immediately this wasn't a pocket dial. It was a girl named Sarah. She was calling from a large, isolated Victorian house on the very edge of the northern woods. Her voice was a whisper, so faint and fragile that I had to press my headset against my ear until it physically hurt, just to catch the syllables. She told me she was hiding in her upstairs nursery closet, buried under a heavy pile of old winter coats and mothballed blankets. Her voice was shaken so hard I could hear her teeth chattering. She said her parents had come home early from a dinner party, but they hadn't turned on a single light in the house. She had watched them from the shadows of the upstairs banister as they walked through the front door. She described them walking into the kitchen with a synchronized, mechanical gait, like puppets on strings. She said they were just standing there in the dark, facing the cabinets, perfectly still. No words, no movement. But then she started to hear the humming. She told me it wasn't a song she recognized. It was a rhythmic, distorted vibration that sounded like a radio caught between 2 stations, a low-frequency buzzing that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards of the house. Sarah started to sob, her breath hitching in her throat, when she told me what happened next. She said her father's head started to turn. It didn't stop where a human neck should naturally stop. It just kept twisting, the sound of dry wood snapping, until his head had rotated 360 degrees, his face looking directly up at the stairs where she was hiding in the shadows. She had bolted to the nursery and locked the door, but she knew the wood was too thin. I tried to stay calm for her, telling her the police were on their way, but I knew the truth. The snow was so thick that the nearest patrol car was at least 10 minutes out, struggling through 3 feet of unplowed drifts. The silence on the line became a physical weight. I could hear her shallow, terrified breathing. And then a sound started coming through the line that I will never forget. It was a heavy, wet, dragging sound coming from the upstairs hallway. It sounded like a massive bag of raw meat being pulled slowly across the carpet, inch by inch, toward the nursery door. Sarah was paralyzed. She whispered to me that the dragging sound had stopped right outside her closet door. The house was deathly silent except for the wind outside and that low, buzzing hum that never seemed to stop. Then, her father's voice called out from the other side of the closet door. It was perfect. It was the same warm, comforting, baritone tone he'd used her whole life to tuck her into bed. He was telling her to come out, saying that the game was over, that they just wanted to show her something special they had found in the basement. He sounded so loving, so normal. But Sarah knew better, because at that exact same moment, through the thin walls of the old house, she could hear the other version of her father, still humming that distorted, static-filled melody in the kitchen, 2 floors below. She was caught between 2 versions of the same man, and one of them was standing inches away from her hiding spot. And then, the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced in 30 years of emergency dispatch happened. The voice outside her door stopped being her father. It shifted, the pitch warping and stretching like a cassette tape being eaten by a machine. It began to mimic me. It repeated exactly what I just said to her, but with a 1-second delay. If I told her, "Sarah, stay calm," the thing outside her door would whisper, "Sarah, stay calm," in my exact voice, with my exact inflection, even replicating the slight rasp in my throat from the cold coffee. It was a mirror in the dark, reflecting my own identity back at me through the phone line. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I heard the sound of the closet door splintering. It wasn't being kicked or forced. It was being squeezed like the frame couldn't handle the pressure of whatever was trying to enter. Sarah let out a short, sharp gasp, a sound of pure realization-filled horror. And then the line went dead. But the call didn't end. My console showed the connection was still live, the timer still ticking away the seconds. I sat there, frozen in my chair, listening to the static, praying to hear a siren in the background. Then my own voice came back through the headset. Not Sarah's voice. Mine. It was calm, professional, and chillingly polite. It said, "You have such a soothing voice, Mike. I think I'll use it to call your wife next. I didn't speak for an entire week after that shift. My supervisors tried to tell me it was a prank, a high-tech hack, but I knew what I felt. When the police finally arrived at the house 20 minutes later, they found it empty. No blood, no signs of a struggle. The only thing they found unusual was that every single mirror in the house had been smashed into 1,000 tiny pieces, and the shards were piled neatly in the center of the nursery floor. Sarah and her parents were never seen again. And to this day, I can't look at my own reflection in the dark without wondering whose voice is really coming out of my mouth. This is a story that still makes my hands shake every time I see a thunderstorm. It was a humid, suffocating night in July of 2013. The air was so thick you could almost feel it in your lungs, and a massive electrical storm was rolling in from the coast. An elderly man named Mr. Henderson called from a quiet, upscale cul-de-sac on the south side of town. Mr. Henderson was a retired history teacher, a man known for being incredibly precise, calm, and observant. He told me he was looking out his large front window and saw a man in a bright neon yellow raincoat standing perfectly still in the middle of his neighbor's driveway. It was pouring rain, a total deluge. But Mr. Henderson noted something that didn't make sense. He said the water seemed to curve around the man in the raincoat as if he were encased in a bubble. The man wasn't getting wet at all. He described the man walking slowly up to the miller's house, his neighbor, and smashing the large front bay window with a rusted, heavy industrial hammer. I immediately pulled up the live city cam for that street, my heart racing against my ribs. I expected to see a chaotic crime scene, flashing lights, or a man fleeing. But on my monitor, the street was bone dry. The pavement was dusty. The trees were still. And the sun was actually setting in the video feed, even though it was nearly midnight in reality. I checked the camera's timestamp, thinking it was frozen, but the seconds were ticking by normally. I told Mr. Henderson the street looked fine, that the miller's house was dark and quiet. He started screaming at me, his voice cracking with a level of terror I had never heard from him. He said he could hear Mrs. Miller begging for her life. He could hear the sound of the hammer hitting wood and bone. I felt a pit form in my stomach. I searched the cold case archives while he was shouting, my fingers flying across the keyboard. My stomach dropped through the floor. Exactly 9 years ago, to the very night, during a similar storm, the Miller family had been murdered by an unidentified intruder wearing a yellow raincoat. The case had remained one of the city's most infamous, unsolved mysteries. I realized then that Mr. Henderson wasn't lying, but he wasn't seeing the present. He was witnessing a haunting, a psychic scar, or a literal rip in time itself. I tried to tell him it wasn't real, that he was seeing a ghost of the past, a memory trapped in the house. But then his voice went dead quiet. He said, "Mike, the man has stopped. He's turning around. He's looking directly at my window now. And Mike, he's starting to walk toward my house." Mr. Henderson's voice shifted from frantic panic to a dead, hollow whisper that chilled me to the bone. He said the man in the yellow coat was crossing the street, stepping over the puddles that didn't exist on my screen. I watched the CityCam feed with desperate intensity, praying for some sign of movement. But the street remained empty, bathed in the orange glow of a peaceful sunset. Then I heard it through the headset, a sound that shouldn't have been possible. I heard the unmistakable thunderous sound of glass shattering. Not in the past, not from the Miller's house, but in Mr. Henderson's own living room. He told me the air in his house had suddenly turned ice cold, smelling like stagnant pond water and old oxidized copper. He was hiding under his bed now, the phone clutched to his ear so tightly I could hear the plastic caisson groan. He told me he could hear the heavy rhythmic thud of a hammer hitting the hardwood floorboards in the hallway outside his bedroom. Each step sounded wet, a heavy splashing sound, like the man was dripping gallons of water, even though it wasn't raining inside the house. I heard the bedroom door creak open on its old hinges. I heard Mr. Henderson begin to pray, his voice a frantic, low mumble of Latin and English. And then I heard a sound that has haunted my dreams for over a decade. the sound of a heavy metal object crushing something soft and wet. The line went silent, but the connection remained open for another 3 minutes of absolute, terrifying stillness. When the police finally arrived and breached the property, they found the house perfectly sealed. Every door was locked from the inside and every window was intact. There was no evidence of an intruder, no broken glass, and no water on the floors. They found Mr. Henderson in his bed, his eyes open, looking as if he had simply died in his sleep. That is, until they turned him over. The back of his head had been completely caved in by a massive blunt force trauma. The medical examiner was baffled. It looked like he had been hit with an industrial sledgehammer, yet there was no weapon found. The lab results from the scene came back a week later and stopped the entire department in its tracks. They found a single, wet footprint on the carpet right next to his bed. The water in that footprint didn't match the rain from that night. The chemical analysis proved the water had been stagnant, trapped in an airtight environment for exactly 9 years. Whatever had killed the Millers in the past had finally come back to finish the only man who had ever truly seen it. I retired shortly after that. You see, in my line of work, you learn that the past isn't always behind you. Sometimes it's just waiting for the right storm to walk back through your front door. This is the call that officially never happened. If you were to go through the archives of my dispatch center for the night of October 12th, 2012, you would notice a gaping 15-minute hole in the call logs. My supervisor at the time told me it was a simple server glitch, a minor technical error that wiped a few minutes of data. But I knew he was lying. I could see it in the way he avoided my eyes the next morning, the way his hands shook when he handed me my coffee. It was a Tuesday night, the kind of night where the air feels heavy with something unspoken, like a storm is brewing, but the clouds are too stubborn to break. The static electricity in the dispatch room was so high that the hair on my arms stood up every time I leaned toward my console. The monitors were flickering with a strange, rhythmic interference. Then Lean 4 lit up with a dull, unnatural red glow. On my screen, the location data was malfunctioning. The cursor was jumping frantically across the map, flickering between unknown and a very specific set of coordinates deep inside Blackwood National Forest, a place known as Zone 4. Now you have to understand something about Zone 4. It's been closed to the public since 1974. The cave systems there are notoriously unstable, and the government sealed every known entrance after a group of experienced hikers went in and simply vanished into the earth. There are stories about those caves, things the park rangers only whisper about after they've had too much to drink. When I answered the call, there was no human voice on the other end. There was only the sound of wind. But it wasn't the kind of wind that whistles through the pine trees. It was a deep, resonant, hollow sound, like air being forced through a massive, wet, organic pipe. I said my usual greeting. 911, what is your emergency? Silence. Just that rhythmic, heavy wind, almost like a giant pair of lungs, was breathing into the receiver. I was about to hang up, thinking it was a ghost call from a faulty line, when I heard a metallic scratching sound. Then a voice broke through the static. It was thin, distorted, and sounded like a recording played at the wrong speed. It said, "It's so cold down here, Mike." My heart stopped in my chest. I hadn't told the caller my name. I checked my console again, my fingers trembling. The call was tracing back to an old outdoor payphone booth sitting on a rusted post at the very edge of the forest. A payphone that had its wires cut 30 years ago. I ordered the caller to stay on the line. I told them I was sending help, that the Rangers were already being dispatched to the trailhead. But the voice just laughed. It wasn't a human laugh. It was the sound of two massive stones grinding together in a dark basement. The voice began to describe the cave behind it. It said the walls weren't made of rock anymore. It said they were soft, warm, and covered in a thin, translucent film of skin. It claimed that the cave walls were pulsing and bulging in perfect time with its own breath. The voice told me it had been waiting in that dark, wet silence for a very, very long time. It said that it had finally allowed a connection to be made, just for this one night. I asked what it was. The line went completely silent for 30 agonizing seconds. I sat there in my chair, heart hammering against my ribs, listening to the static which seemed to be forming words I didn't want to understand. Then a whisper arrived, so clear that it felt like someone was standing right behind my headset in the dispatch room. The thing that lives in the echo. It likes the way you listen, Mike. I heard the heavy clatter of the receiver hitting the floor of the booth. Then a sound I can only describe as something massive, segmented and viscous, dragging itself painfully over the gravel, moving out of the booth and into the thick brush of the forest. The Rangers went out the next morning to investigate. They found the isolated payphone booth. The receiver was hanging by its cord, swinging slowly in the wind. But the wires weren't just cut. They were fused together with a strange, black moss. The inside of the phone was filled with a substance the lab could never identify for certain. Something that looked like dried human muscle tissue that had been there for decades. They found no footprints around the structure. Only a trail of thick, black slime that led directly into the heart of the restricted zone, where no man is allowed to go. I never answered another call from the edge of Blackwood Forest again. I know that if I did, it wouldn't be a voice I'd hear, but the echo of my own death waiting for me somewhere in those caves. This is the reason I don't have mirrors in my house anymore. Not a single one. Not in the bathroom, not in the hallway, and certainly not in the bedroom. It was my very last year before retirement, a time when you think you've heard everything the human soul can scream out in the middle of the night. I was wrong. A man named David called around 2 a.m. His voice was flat, a dead tone that gave me more chills than any frantic screaming ever could. It's always a bad sign when a caller is too calm. He told me he was standing in his bathroom on the top floor of a high-end apartment complex downtown. He had just finished brushing his teeth and was looking at his own reflection in the large, expensive mirror above the vanity. He said, "Mike, I just blinked." But the man in the mirror didn't. I laughed nervously, thinking he was under the influence of something or just severely sleep-deprived. I told him to turn off the light and go to bed. But he wouldn't move. He said his reflection was still staring at him, eyes wide open, never once breaking its gaze. And then he added that the reflection was starting to smile. David wasn't smiling. He was crying, the tears streaming down his face. But in the mirror, his double was wearing a grin so wide that the skin seemed to be cracking at the corners of its mouth. I ordered David to leave the bathroom immediately. He obeyed, walking backward into his living room, clutching the cordless phone in his hand. He sat down on his sofa, staring at the black, blank screen of his massive television. He whispered to me, "He's in the TV now, Mike." I can see him sitting right next to me in the reflection of the glass. He's leaning his head on my shoulder. But when I turn my head to the cushion right next to me, it's empty. I could hear David's breathing becoming faster, a sharp, whistling sound of pure terror. I told him to close his eyes. I told him that if the reflections couldn't be seen, they couldn't exist in his reality. He did it. He sat there in the total darkness of his living room, describing the heavy silence of the apartment to me. But suddenly, the audio quality of the call shifted. It became hollow, with a strange, metallic echo, as if he were now standing in a vast gallery made entirely of glass. David's voice wasn't flat anymore. It had become vibrant, full of life, and almost unnervingly happy. David said, "Mike, I'm not the one with my eyes closed anymore. He is. I'm the one watching him from inside the glass now. It's so much brighter in here. I can finally feel the air on my skin, even if the air tastes like copper." I heard a sound like a thin sheet of ice shattering, a delicate crystalline crack that echoed through the line, followed by the sound of thousands of glass shards hitting a carpeted floor. Then the line went abruptly dead. When the police arrived on the scene 10 minutes later, they found the apartment in perfect order. There were no signs of a struggle and no forced entry. They found David standing in the hallway, facing a large wall mirror. He wasn't moving. He wasn't blinking. He was staring at his own reflection with an intensity that terrified the officers. When they took him to the psychiatric ward, he stayed in that catatonic state for months, never speaking a word, never eating on his own. One night, a nurse reported seeing him pressing his forehead against the glass of his observation window at 3 a.m. He whispered against the glass, where his breath formed a thick fog. 5 stars for the service, Mike. You really helped me get out." I retired the next day. I realized that for 30 years, I hadn't just been answering distress calls. I had been opening doors that should have stayed locked forever. And I know, somewhere in this city, that the man who called me that night is still there, trapped behind a reflective surface, desperately looking for a way back, while the other walks among us with a smile that never quite reaches his eyes. Since that day, I cover every screen in my house before I sleep. You never know who is watching from the other side.